This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 5. Her wit values itself so highly that to her all matter else seems weak. Much Ado About Nothing. Gwendolen's reception in the neighborhood fulfilled her uncle's expectations. From Brackenshaw Castle to the Firs at Winchester, where Mr. Quallen the banker kept a generous house, she was welcomed with manifest admiration, and even those ladies who did not quite like her felt a comfort in having a new, striking girl to invite. For hostesses who entertain much must make up their parties as ministers make up their cabinets, on grounds other than personal liking. Then, in order to have Gwendolen as a guest, it was not necessary to ask any one who was disagreeable, for Mrs. Davilow always made a quiet, picturesque figure as a chaperone, and Mr. Gascoigne was everywhere in request for his own sake. Among the houses where Gwendolen was not quite liked and yet invited was Quetcham Hall. One of her first invitations was to a large dinner party there, which made a sort of general introduction for her to the society of the neighborhood. For in a select party of 30 and of well-composed proportions as to age, few visitable families could be entirely left out. No youthful figure there was comparable to Gwendolen's as she passed through the long suite of rooms adorned with light and flowers, and visible at first as a slim figure floating along in white drapery, approached through one wide doorway after another into fuller illumination and definiteness. She had never had that sort of promenade before, and she felt exultingly that it befitted her. Any one looking at her for the first time might have supposed that long galleries and lackeys had always been a matter of course in her life, while her cousin Anna, who was really more familiar with these things, felt almost as much embarrassed as a rabbit suddenly deposited in that well-lit space. "Who is that with Gascoigne?" said the archdeacon, neglecting a discussion of military manoeuvres on which, as a clergyman, he was naturally appealed to, and his son on the other side of the room, a hopeful young scholar, who had already suggested some not less elegant than ingenious emendations of Greek texts, said nearly at the same time, "By George, who is that girl with the awfully well-set head and jolly figure?" But to a mind of general benevolence, wishing everybody to look well, it was rather exasperating to see how Gwendolen eclipsed others; how even the handsome Miss Law, explained to be the daughter of Lady Law, looked suddenly broad, heavy, and inanimate; and how Miss Arrowpoint, unfortunately also dressed in white, immediately resembled a carte de visite in which one would fancy the skirt alone to have been charged for. Since Miss Arrowpoint was generally liked for the amiable, unpretending way in which she wore her fortunes, and made a softening screen for the oddities of her mother, there seemed to be some unfitness in Gwendolen's looking so much more like a person of social importance. "She is not really so handsome if you come to examine her features," said Mrs. Arrowpoint, later in the evening, confidentially to Mrs. Vulcany. "It is a certain style she has, which produces a great effect at first, but afterward she is less agreeable." In fact, Gwendolen, not intending it, but intending the contrary, had offended her hostess, who, though not a splenetic or vindictive woman, had her susceptibilities. Several conditions had met in the lady of Quetcham, which to the reasoners in that neighborhood seemed to have an essential connection with each other. It was occasionally recalled that she had been the heiress of a fortune gained by some moist or dry business in the city, in order fully to account for her having a squat figure, a harsh parrot-like voice, and a systematically high head-dress. And since these points made her externally rather ridiculous, it appeared to many only natural that she should have what are called literary tendencies. A little comparison would have shown that all these points are to be found apart, daughters of aldermen being often well-grown and well-featured, pretty women having sometimes harsh or husky voices, and the production of feeble literature being found compatible with the most diverse forms of physique, masculine as well as feminine. Gwendolen, who had a keen sense of absurdity in others, but was kindly disposed toward anyone who could make life agreeable to her, meant to win Mrs. Arrowpoint by giving her an interest and attention beyond what others were probably inclined to show. But self-confidence is apt to address itself to an imaginary dullness in others, as people who are well off speak in a cajoling tone to the poor, and those who are in the prime of life raise their voice and talk artificially to seniors, hastily conceiving them to be deaf and rather imbecile. Gwendolen, with all her cleverness and purpose to be agreeable, could not escape that form of stupidity. It followed in her mind unreflectingly that because Mrs. Arrowpoint was ridiculous, she was also likely to be wanting in penetration, and she went through her little scenes without suspicion that the various shades of her behavior were all noted. "You are fond of books as well as of music, riding, and archery, I hear," Mrs. Arrowpoint said, going to her for a tete-a-tete in the drawing-room after dinner. "Catherine will be very glad to have so sympathetic a neighbor." This little speech might have seemed the most graceful politeness, spoken in a low, melodious tone, but with a twang fatally loud it gave Gwendolen a sense of exercising patronage when she answered gracefully, "It is I who am fortunate. Miss Arrowpoint will teach me what good music is. I shall be entirely a learner. I hear that she is a thorough musician." "Catherine has certainly had every advantage. We have a first-rate musician in the house now, Herr Klesmer. Perhaps you know all his compositions? You must allow me to introduce him to you. You sing, I believe. Catherine plays 3 instruments, but she does not sing. I hope you will let us hear you. I understand you are an accomplished singer." "Oh, no. Die Kraft ist schwach, allein die Lust ist groß, as Mephistopheles says." "Ah, you are a student of Goethe. Young ladies are so advanced now. I suppose you have read everything." "No, really. I shall be so glad if you will tell me what to read. I have been looking into all the books in the library at Offendene, but there is nothing readable. The leaves all stick together and smell musty. I wish I could write books to amuse myself, as you can. How delightful it must be to write books after one's own taste instead of reading other people's. Homemade books must be so nice." For an instant Mrs. Arrowpoint's glance was a little sharper, but the perilous resemblance to satire in the last sentence took the hue of girlish simplicity when Gwendolen added, "I would give anything to write a book." "And why should you not?" said Mrs. Arrowpoint encouragingly. "You have but to begin as I did. Pen, ink, and paper are at everybody's command, but I will send you all I have written with pleasure." "Thanks. I shall be so glad to read your writings. Being acquainted with authors must give a peculiar understanding of their books. One would be able to tell then which parts were funny and which serious. I am sure I often laugh in the wrong place." Here Gwendolen herself became aware of danger, and added quickly, "In Shakespeare, you know, and other great writers that we can never see. But I always want to know more than there is in the books." "If you are interested in any of my subjects, I can lend you many extra sheets in manuscript," said Mrs. Arrowpoint, while Gwendolen felt herself painfully in the position of the young lady who professed to like potted sprats. "These are things I dare say I shall publish eventually. Several friends have urged me to do so, and one doesn't like to be obstinate. My Tasso, for example. I should have made it twice the size." "I dote on Tasso," said Gwendolen. "Well, you shall have all my papers if you like. So many, you know, have written about Tasso, but they are all wrong. As to the peculiar nature of his madness and his feelings for Leonora, and the real cause of his imprisonment, and the character of Leonora, who in my opinion was a cold-hearted woman, else she would have married him in spite of her brother, they are all wrong. I differ from everybody." "How very interesting," said Gwendolen. "I like to differ from everybody. I think it is so stupid to agree. That is the worst of writing your opinions, and make people agree with you." This speech renewed a slight suspicion in Mrs. Arrowpoint, and again her glance became for a moment examining, but Gwendolen looked very innocent, and continued with a docile air, "I know nothing of Tasso except the Gerusalemme Liberata, which we read and learned by heart at school." "Ah, his life is more interesting than his poetry. I have constructed the early part of his life as a sort of romance. When one thinks of his father Bernardo and so on, there is much that must be true." "Imagination is often truer than fact," said Gwendolen decisively, though she could no more have explained these glib words than if they had been Coptic or Etruscan. "I shall be so glad to learn all about Tasso, and his madness especially. I suppose poets are always a little mad." "To be sure, the poet's eye in a fine frenzy rolling, and somebody says of Marlowe, 'For that fine madness still he did maintain, Which always should possess the poet's brain.'" "But it was not always found out, was it?" said Gwendolen innocently. "I suppose some of them rolled their eyes in private. Mad people are often very cunning." Again a shade flitted over Mrs. Arrowpoint's face, but the entrance of the gentleman prevented any immediate mischief between her and this too quick young lady, who had overacted her naivete. "Ah, here comes Herr Klesmer," said Mrs. Arrowpoint, rising; and presently bringing him to Gwendolen, she left them to a dialogue which was agreeable on both sides, Herr Klesmer being a felicitous combination of the German, the Slav, and the Semite, with grand features, brown hair floating in artistic fashion, and brown eyes in spectacles. His English had little foreignness except its fluency, and his alarming cleverness was made less formidable just then by a certain softening air of stillness which will sometimes befall even genius in the desire of being agreeable to beauty. Music was soon begun. Miss Arrowpoint and Herr Klesmer played a four-handed piece on two pianos, which convinced the company in general that it was long, and Gwendolen in particular that the neutral, placid-faced Miss Arrowpoint had a mastery of the instrument which put her own execution out of question, though she was not discouraged as to her often praised touch and style. After this every one became anxious to hear Gwendolen sing, especially Mr. Arrowpoint, as was natural in a host and a perfect gentleman, of whom no one had anything to say but that he married Miss Cutler and imported the best cigars. And he led her to the piano with easy politeness. Herr Klesmer closed the instrument in readiness for her, and smiled with pleasure at her approach, then placed himself at a distance of a few feet, so that he could see her as she sang. Gwendolen was not nervous. What she undertook to do she did without trembling, and singing was an enjoyment to her. Her voice was a moderately powerful soprano. Some one had told her it was like Jenny Lind's. Her ear good, and she was able to keep in tune, so that her singing gave pleasure to ordinary hearers, and she had been used to unmingled applause. She had the rare advantage of looking almost prettier when she was singing than at other times, and that Herr Klesmer was in front of her seemed not disagreeable. Her song, determined on beforehand, was a favorite aria of Bellini's in which she felt quite sure of herself. "Charming," said Mr. Arrowpoint, who had remained near, and the word was echoed around without more insincerity than we recognize in a brotherly way as human. But Herr Klesmer stood like a statue, if a statue can be imagined in spectacles. At least he was as mute as a statue. Gwendolen was pressed to keep her seat and double the general pleasure, and she did not wish to refuse. But before resolving to do so, she moved a little toward Herr Klesmer, saying with a look of smiling appeal, "It would be too cruel to a great musician. You cannot like to hear poor amateur singing." "No, truly, but that makes nothing," said Herr Klesmer, suddenly speaking in an odious German fashion with staccato endings, quite unobservable in him before, and apparently depending on a change of mood, as Irishmen resume their strongest brogue when they are fervid or quarrelsome. "That makes nothing. It is always acceptable to see you sing." Was there ever so unexpected an assertion of superiority? At least before the late Teutonic conquest? Gwendolen colored deeply, but with her usual presence of mind, did not show an ungraceful resentment by moving away immediately; and Miss Arrowpoint, who had been near enough to overhear, and also to observe that Herr Klesmer's mode of looking at Gwendolen was more conspicuously admiring than was quite consistent with good taste, now with the utmost tact and kindness came close to her and said, "Imagine what I have to go through with this professor. He can hardly tolerate anything we English do in music. We can only put up with his severity and make use of it to find out the worst that can be said of us. It is a little comfort to know that, and one can bear it when every one else is admiring." "I should be very much obliged to him for telling me the worst," said Gwendolen, recovering herself. "I dare say I have been extremely ill taught, in addition to having no talent, only liking for music." This was very well expressed, considering that it had never entered her mind before. "Yes, it is true. You have not been well taught," said Herr Klesmer, quietly. Woman was dear to him, but music was dearer. "Still, you are not quite without gifts. You sing in tune, and you have a pretty fair organ. But you produce your notes badly, and that music which you sing is beneath you. It is a form of melody which expresses a puerile state of culture, a dawdling, canting, seesaw kind of stuff, the passion and thought of people without any breadth of horizon. There is a sort of self-satisfied folly about every phrase of such melody. No cries of deep, mysterious passion, no conflict, no sense of the universal. It makes men small as they listen to it. Sing now something larger, and I shall see." "Oh, not now, by and by," said Gwendolen, with a sinking of heart at the sudden width of horizon opened round her small musical performance. For a lady desiring to lead, this first encounter in her campaign was startling. But she was bent on not behaving foolishly, and Miss Arrowpoint helped her by saying, "Yes, by and by. I always require half an hour to get up my courage after being criticized by Herr Klesmer. We will ask him to play to us now. He is bound to show us what is good music." To be quite safe on this point, Herr Klesmer played a composition of his own, a fantasia called Freudvoll, Leidvoll, Gedankenvoll, an extensive commentary on some melodic ideas not too grossly evident, and he certainly fetched as much variety and depth of passion out of the piano as that moderately responsive instrument lends itself to, having an imperious magic in his fingers that seemed to send a nerve thrill through ivory key and wooden hammer, and compel the strings to make a quivering, lingering speech for him. Gwendolen, in spite of her wounded egoism, had fullness of nature enough to feel the power of his playing, and it gradually turned her inward sob of mortification into an excitement which lifted her for the moment into a desperate indifference about her own doings, or at least a determination to get a superiority over them by laughing at them, as if they belonged to somebody else. Her eyes had become brighter, her cheeks slightly flushed, and her tongue ready for any mischievous remarks. "I wish you would sing to us again, Miss Harleth," said young Clintock, the archdeacon's classical son, who had been so fortunate as to take her to dinner, and came up to renew conversation as soon as Herr Klesmer's performance was ended. "That is the style of music for me. I never can make anything of this tip-top playing. It is like a jar of leeches, where you can never tell either beginnings or endings. I could listen to your singing all day." "Yes, we would be glad of something popular now. Another song from you would be a relaxation," said Mrs. Arrowpoint, who had also come near with polite intentions. "That must be because you are in a puerile state of culture and have no breadth of horizon. I have just learned that. I have been taught how bad my taste is, and am feeling growing pains. They are never pleasant," said Gwendolen, not taking any notice of Mrs. Arrowpoint, and looking up with a bright smile at young Clintock. Mrs. Arrowpoint was not insensible to this rudeness, but merely said, "Well, we will not press anything disagreeably," and as there was a perceptible outburst of imprisoned conversation just then, and a movement of guests seeking each other, she remained seated where she was, and looked around her with the relief of a hostess at finding she is not needed. "I am glad you like this neighborhood," said young Clintock, well pleased with his station in front of Gwendolen. "Exceedingly. There seems to be a little of everything and not much of anything." "That is rather equivocal praise." "Not with me. I like a little of everything. A little absurdity, for example, is very amusing. I am thankful for a few queer people, but much of them is a bore." Mrs. Arrowpoint, who was hearing this dialogue, perceived quite a new tone in Gwendolen's speech, and felt a revival of doubt as to her interest in Tasso's madness. "I think there should be more croquet for one thing," young Clintock said. I am usually away, but if I were more here I should go in for a croquet club. You are one of the archers, I think. But depend upon it, croquet is the game of the future. It wants writing up, though. One of our best men has written a poem on it, in 4 cantos, as good as Pope. I want him to publish it. You never read anything better. I shall study croquet to-morrow. I shall take to it instead of singing. No, no, not that, but do take to croquet. I will send you Jennings' poem if you like. I have a manuscript copy. Is he a great friend of yours? Well, rather. Oh, if he is only rather, I think I will decline. Or if you send it to me, will you promise not to catechize me upon it and ask me which part I like best? Because it is not so easy to know a poem without reading it as to know a sermon without listening. Decidedly, Mrs. Arrowpoint thought, this girl is double and satirical. I shall be on my guard against her. But Gwendolen, nevertheless, continued to receive polite attentions from the family at Quetcham, not merely because invitations have larger grounds than those of personal liking, but because the trying little scene at the piano had awakened a kindly solicitude toward her in the gentle mind of Miss Arrowpoint, who managed all the invitations and visits, her mother being otherwise occupied. End of chapter 5. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 6.
Croyez-vous m'avoir humilié pour m'avoir appris que la terre tournait autour du soleil? Je vous jure que je ne m'en estime pas moins. Fontanelle, Pluralité des mondes.
That lofty criticism had caused Gwendolen a new sort of pain. She would not have chosen to confess how unfortunate she thought herself in not having had Miss Arrowpoint's musical advantages, so as to be able to question Herr Klesmer's taste with the confidence of thorough knowledge; still less to admit even to herself that Miss Arrowpoint each time they met raised an unwonted feeling of jealousy in her, not in the least because she was an heiress, but because it was really provoking that a girl whose appearance you could not characterize except by saying that her figure was slight and of middle stature, her features small, her eyes tolerable, and her complexion sallow, had nevertheless a certain mental superiority which could not be explained away, an exasperating thoroughness in her musical accomplishment, a fastidious discrimination in her general tastes, which made it impossible to force her admiration and kept you in awe of her standard. This insignificant-looking young lady of 24, whom any one's eyes would have passed over negligently if she had not been Miss Arrowpoint, might be suspected of a secret opinion that Miss Harleth's acquirements were rather of a common order, and such an opinion was not made agreeable to think of by being always veiled under a perfect kindness of manner. But Gwendolen did not like to dwell on facts which threw an unfavorable light on herself. The musical magus who had so suddenly widened her horizon was not always on the scene, and his being constantly backward and forward between London and Quetcham soon began to be thought of as offering opportunities for converting him to a more admiring state of mind. Meanwhile, in the manifest pleasure her singing gave at Brackenshaw Castle, the Firs, and elsewhere, she recovered her equanimity, being disposed to think approval more trustworthy than objection, and not being one of the exceptional persons who have a parching thirst for a perfection undemanded by their neighbors. Perhaps it would have been rash to say then that she was at all exceptional inwardly, or that the unusual in her was more than her rare grace of movement and bearing, and a certain daring which gave piquancy to a very common egoistic ambition, such as exists under many clumsy exteriors and is taken no notice of. For I suppose that the set of the head does not really determine the hunger of the inner self for supremacy. It only makes a difference sometimes as to the way in which the supremacy is held attainable, and a little also to the degree in which it can be attained, especially when the hungry one is a girl, whose passion for doing what is remarkable has an ideal limit in consistency with the highest breeding and perfect freedom from the sordid need of income. Gwendolen was as inwardly rebellious against the restraints of family conditions, and as ready to look through obligations into her own fundamental want of feeling for them, as if she had been sustained by the boldest speculations. But she really had no such speculations, and would at once have marked herself off from any sort of theoretical or practically reforming women by satirizing them. She rejoiced to feel herself exceptional, but her horizon was that of the genteel romance where the heroine's soul poured out in her journal is full of vague power, originality, and general rebellion, while her life moves strictly in the sphere of fashion. And if she wanders into a swamp, the pathos lies partly, so to speak, in her having on her satin shoes. Here is a restraint which nature and society have provided on the pursuit of striking adventure, so that a soul burning with a sense of what the universe is not, and ready to take all existence as fuel, is nevertheless held captive by the ordinary wire-work of social forms, and does nothing particular. This commonplace result was what Gwendolen found herself threatened with even in the novelty of the first winter at Offendene. What she was clear upon was that she did not wish to lead the same sort of life as ordinary young ladies did. But what she was not clear upon was how she should set about leading any other, and what were the particular acts which she would assert her freedom by doing. Offendene remained a good background, if anything would happen there, but on the whole the neighborhood was in fault. Beyond the effect of her beauty on a first presentation, there was not much excitement to be got out of her earliest invitations, and she came home after little sallies of satire and knowingness, such as had offended Mrs. Arrowpoint, to fill the intervening days with the most girlish devices. The strongest assertion she was able to make of her individual claims was to leave out Alice's lessons, on the principle that Alice was more likely to excel in ignorance, and to employ her with Miss Mary, and the maid who was understood to wait on all the ladies, in helping to arrange various dramatic costumes which Gwendolen pleased herself with having in readiness for some future occasions of acting in charades or theatrical pieces, occasions which she meant to bring about by force of will or contrivance. She had never acted, only made a figure in tableaux vivants at school, but she felt assured that she could act well, and having been once or twice to the Theatre Français, and also heard her mamma speak of Rachel, her waking dreams and cogitations as to how she would manage her destiny sometimes turned on the question whether she would become an actress like Rachel, since she was more beautiful than that thin Jewess. Meanwhile the wet days before Christmas were passed pleasantly in the preparation of costumes, Greek, Oriental, and composite, in which Gwendolen attitudinized and speechified before a domestic audience, including even the housekeeper, who was once pressed into it that she might swell the notes of applause, but having shown herself unworthy by observing that Miss Harleth looked more like a queen in her own dress than in that baggy thing with her arms all bare, she was not invited a second time. "Do I look as well as Rachel, mamma?" said Gwendolen one day when she had been showing herself in her Greek dress to Anna, and going through scraps of scenes with much tragic intention. "You have better arms than Rachel," said Mrs. Davilow. "Your arms would do for anything, Gwen. But your voice is not so tragic as hers. It is not so deep." "I can make it deeper if I like," said Gwendolen, provisionally. Then she added with decision, "I think a higher voice is more tragic. It is more feminine, and the more feminine a woman is, the more tragic it seems when she does desperate actions." "There may be something in that," said Mrs. Davilow, languidly. "But I don't know what good there is in making one's blood creep, and if there is anything horrible to be done, I should like it to be left to the men." "Oh, mamma, you are so dreadfully prosaic. As if all the great poetic criminals were not women. I think the men are poor, cautious creatures." "Well, dear, and you, who are afraid to be alone in the night, I don't think you would be very bold in crime, thank God." "I'm not talking about reality, mamma," said Gwendolen impatiently. Then her mamma being called out of the room, she turned quickly to her cousin, as if taking an opportunity, and said, "Anna, do ask my uncle to let us get up some charades at the rectory. Mr. Middleton and Warham could act with us, just for practice. Mamma says it will not do to have Mr. Middleton consulting and rehearsing here. He is a stick, but we could give him suitable parts. Do ask, or else I will." "Oh, not till Rex comes. He is so clever, and such a dear old thing, and he will act Napoleon looking over the sea. He looks just like Napoleon. Rex can do anything." "I don't in the least believe in your Rex, Anna," said Gwendolen, laughing at her. "He will turn out to be like those wretched blue and yellow water-colors of his which you hang up in your bedroom and worship." "Very well, you will see," said Anna. "It is not that I know what is clever, but he has got a scholarship already, and papa says he will get a fellowship, and nobody is better at games. He is cleverer than Mr. Middleton, and everybody but you call Mr. Middleton clever." "So he may be in a dark lantern sort of way, but he is a stick. If he had to say, 'Perdition catch my soul, but I do love her,' he would say it in just the same tone as, 'Here endeth the second lesson.'" "Oh, Gwendolen," said Anna, shocked at these promiscuous allusions. "And it is very unkind of you to speak so of him, for he admires you very much. I heard Warham say one day to mamma, 'Middleton is regularly spoony upon Gwendolen.' She was very angry with him, but I know what it means. It is what they say at college for being in love." "How can I help it?" said Gwendolen, rather contemptuously. "Perdition catch my soul if I love him." "No, of course. Papa, I think, would not wish it. And he is to go away soon. But it makes me sorry when you ridicule him." "What shall you do to me when I ridicule Rex?" said Gwendolen wickedly. "Now, Gwendolen, dear, you will not," said Anna, her eyes filling with tears. "I could not bear it. But there really is nothing in him to ridicule, only you may find out things. No one ever thought of laughing at Mr. Middleton before you. Every one said he was nice looking and his manners perfect. I am sure I have always been frightened at him because of his learning and his square-cut coat, and his being a nephew of the bishop's and all that. But you will not ridicule Rex, promise me." Anna ended with a beseeching look which touched Gwendolen. "You are a dear little coz," she said, just touching the tip of Anna's chin with her thumb and forefinger. "I don't ever want to do anything that will vex you, especially if Rex is to make everything come off, charades and everything." And when at last Rex was there, the animation he brought into the life of Offendene and the rectory, and his ready partnership in Gwendolen's plans, left her no inclination for any ridicule that was not of an open and flattering kind, such as he himself enjoyed. He was a fine, open-hearted youth, with a handsome face strongly resembling his father's and Anna's, but softer in expression than the one, and larger in scale than the other. A bright, healthy, loving nature, enjoying ordinary innocent things so much that vice had no temptation for him, and what he knew of it lay too entirely in the outer courts and little visited chambers of his mind for him to think of it with great repulsion. Vicious habits were with him what some fellows did, stupid stuff, which he liked to keep aloof from. He returned Anna's affection as fully as could be expected of a brother whose pleasures apart from her were more than the sum total of hers, and he had never known a stronger love. The cousins were continually together at the one house or the other, chiefly at Offendene, where there was more freedom, or rather where there was a more complete sway for Gwendolen, and whatever she wished became a ruling purpose for Rex. The charades came off according to her plans, and also some other little scenes not contemplated by her, in which her acting was more impromptu. It was at Offendene that the charades in tableau were rehearsed and presented, Mrs. Davilow seeing no objection even to Mr. Middleton's being invited to share in them, now that Rex too was there, especially as his services were indispensable. Warham, who was studying for India with a Wanchester coach, having no time to spare, and being generally dismal under a cram of everything except the answers needed at the forthcoming examination, which might disclose the welfare of our Indian empire to be somehow connected with the quotable knowledge of Brown's pastorals. Mr. Middleton was persuaded to play various grave parts, Gwendolen having flattered him on his enviable immobility of countenance; and at first a little pained and jealous at her comradeship with Rex, he presently drew encouragement from the thought that this sort of cousinly familiarity excluded any serious passion. Indeed, he occasionally felt that her more formal treatment of himself was such a sign of favor as to warrant his making advances before he left Pennicote, though he had intended to keep his feelings in reserve until his position should be more assured. Miss Gwendolen, quite aware that she was adored by this unexceptionable young clergyman with pale whiskers and square-cut collar, felt nothing more on the subject than that she had no objection to being adored. She turned her eyes on him with calm mercilessness, and caused him many mildly agitating hopes by seeming always to avoid dramatic contact with him, for all meanings, we know, depend on the key of interpretation. Some persons might have thought beforehand that a young man of Anglican leanings, having a sense of sacredness much exercised on small things as well as great, rarely laughing save from politeness, and in general regarding the mention of spades by their naked names as rather coarse, would not have seen a fitting bride for himself in a girl who was daring in ridicule and showed none of the special grace required in the clergyman's wife; or that a young man informed by theological reading would have reflected that he was not likely to meet the taste of a lively, restless young lady like Miss Harleth. But are we always obliged to explain why the facts are not what some persons thought beforehand? The apology lies on their side, who had that erroneous way of thinking. As for Rex, who would possibly have been sorry for poor Middleton if he had been aware of the excellent curate's inward conflict, he was too completely absorbed in a first passion to have observation for any person or thing. He did not observe Gwendolen, he only felt what she said or did, and the back of his head seemed to be a good organ of information as to whether she was in the room or out. Before the end of the first fortnight he was so deeply in love that it was impossible for him to think of his life except as bound up with Gwendolen's. He could see no obstacles, poor boy. His own love seemed a guarantee of hers, since it was one with the unperturbed delight in her image, so that he could no more dream of her giving him pain than an Egyptian could dream of snow. She sang and played to him whenever he liked, was always glad of his companionship in riding, though his borrowed steeds were often comic, was ready to join in any fun of his, and showed a right appreciation of Anna. No mark of sympathy seemed absent. That because Gwendolen was the most perfect creature in the world she was to make a grand match, had not occurred to him. He had no conceit, at least not more than goes to make up the necessary gum and consistence of a substantial personality. It was only that in the young bliss of loving he took Gwendolen's perfection as part of that good which had seemed one with life to him, being the outcome of a happy, well-embodied nature. One incident which happened in the course of their dramatic attempts impressed Rex as a sign of her unusual sensibility. It showed an aspect of her nature which could not have been preconceived by any one who, like him, had only seen her habitual fearlessness in active exercises and her high spirits in society. After a good deal of rehearsing, it was resolved that a select party should be invited to Offendene to witness the performances which went with so much satisfaction to the actors. Anna had caused a pleasant surprise. Nothing could be neater than the way in which she played her little parts. One would have even suspected her of hiding much sly observation under her simplicity. And Mr. Middleton answered very well by not trying to be comic. The main source of doubt and retardation had been Gwendolen's desire to appear in her Greek dress. No word for a charade would occur to her, either waking or dreaming, that suited her purpose of getting a statuesque pose in this favorite costume. To choose a motive from Racine was no use, since Rex and the others could not declaim French verse, and improvised speeches would turn the scene into a burlesque. Besides, Mr. Gascoigne prohibited the acting of scenes from plays. He usually protested against the notion that an amusement which was fitting for every one else was unfitting for a clergyman. But he would not in this matter overstep the line of decorum as drawn in that part of Wessex, which did not exclude his sanction of the young people's acting charades in his sister-in-law's house, a very different affair from private theatricals in the full sense of the word. Everybody, of course, was concerned to satisfy this wish of Gwendolen's, and Rex proposed that they should wind up with a tableau in which the effect of her majesty would not be marred by any one's speech. This pleased her thoroughly, and the only question was the choice of the tableau. "Something pleasant, children, I beseech you," said Mrs. Davilow. "I can't have any Greek wickedness." "It's no worse than Christian wickedness, mamma," said Gwendolen, whose mention of Rachelesque heroines had called forth that remark. "And less scandalous," said Rex. "Besides, one thinks of it as all gone by and done with. What do you say to Briseis being led away? I would be Achilles, and you would be looking round at me, after the print we have at the rectory." "That would be a good attitude for me," said Gwendolen, in a tone of acceptance. But afterward she said with decision, "No, it will not do. There must be 3 men in proper costume, else it will be ridiculous." "I have it," said Rex, after a little reflection. "Hermione as the statue in Winter's Tale? I will be Leontes, and Miss Mary, Paulina, one on each side. Our dress won't signify," he went on laughingly. "It will be more Shakespearean and romantic if Leontes looks like Napoleon and Paulina like a modern spinster." And Hermione was chosen, all agreeing that age was of no consequence. But Gwendolen urged that instead of the mere tableau there should be just enough acting of the scene to introduce the striking up of the music as a signal for her to step down and advance; when Leontes, instead of embracing her, was to kneel and kiss the hem of her garment, and so the curtain was to fall. The antechamber with folding doors lent itself admirably to the purpose of a stage, and the whole of the establishment, with the addition of Jarrett the village carpenter, was absorbed in the preparations for an entertainment, which, considering that it was an imitation of acting, was likely to be successful, since we know from ancient fable that an imitation may have more chance of success than the original. Gwendolen was not without a special exultation in the prospect of this occasion, for she knew that Herr Klesmer was once again at Quetcham, and she had taken care to include him among the invited. Klesmer came. He was in one of his placid, silent moods, and sat in serene contemplation, replying to all appeals in benignant-sounding syllables, more or less articulate, as taking up his cross meekly in a world overgrown with amateurs, or as careful how he moved his lion paws lest he should crush a rampant and vociferous mouse. Everything indeed went off smoothly and according to expectation, all that was improvised and accidental being of a probable sort, until the incident occurred which showed Gwendolen in an unforeseen phase of emotion. How it came about was at first a mystery. The tableau of Hermione was doubly striking from its dissimilarity with what had gone before. It was answering perfectly, and a murmur of applause had been gradually suppressed, while Leontes gave his permission that Paulina should exercise her utmost art and make the statue move. Hermione, her arm resting on a pillar, was elevated by about 6 inches, which she counted on as a means of showing her pretty foot and instep, when at the given signal she should advance and descend. "Music, awake her, strike!" said Paulina. Mrs. Davilow, who by special entreaty had consented to take part in a white burnous and hood. Herr Klesmer, who had been good-natured enough to seat himself at the piano, struck a thunderous chord; but in the same instant, and before Hermione had put forth her foot, the movable panel, which was on a line with the piano, flew open on the right opposite the stage, and disclosed the picture of the dead face and the fleeing figure, brought out in pale definiteness by the position of the wax lights. Every one was startled, but all eyes in the act of turning toward the open panel were recalled by a piercing cry from Gwendolen, who stood without change of attitude, but with a change of expression that was terrifying in its terror. She looked like a statue into which a soul of fear had entered. Her pallid lips were parted, her eyes, usually narrowed under their long lashes, were dilated and fixed. Her mother, less surprised than alarmed, rushed toward her, and Rex too could not help going to her side. But the touch of her mother's arm had the effect of an electric charge. Gwendolen fell on her knees and put her hands before her face. She was still trembling, but mute, and it seemed that she had self-consciousness enough to aim at controlling her signs of terror, for she presently allowed herself to be raised from her kneeling posture and led away, while the company were relieving their minds by explanation. "A magnificent bit of plastique, that," said Klesmer to Miss Arrowpoint, and a quick fire of undertoned question and answer went round. Was it part of the play? Oh no, surely not. Miss Harleth was too much affected. A sensitive creature. Dear me, I was not aware that there was a painting behind that panel. Were you? No, how should I? Some eccentricity in one of the Earl's family long ago, I suppose. How very painful. Pray shut it up. Was the door locked? It is very mysterious. It must be the spirits. But there is no medium present. How do you know that? We must conclude that there is when such things happen. Oh, the door was not locked. It was probably the sudden vibration from the piano that sent it open. This conclusion came from Mr. Gascoigne, who begged Miss Mary, if possible, to get the key. But this readiness to explain the mystery was thought by Mrs. Mulcany unbecoming in a clergyman, and she observed in an undertone that Mr. Gascoigne was always a little too worldly for her taste. However, the key was produced, and the rector turned it in the lock with an emphasis rather offensively rationalizing, as who should say, "It will not start open again," putting the key in his pocket as a security. However, Gwendolen soon reappeared, showing her usual spirits, and evidently determined to ignore as far as she could the striking change she had made in the part of Hermione. But when Klesmer said to her, "We have to thank you for devising a perfect climax. You could not have chosen a finer bit of plastique," there was a flush of pleasure in her face. She liked to accept as a belief what was really no more than delicate feigning. He divined that the betrayal into a passion of fear had been mortifying to her, and wished her to understand that he took it for good acting. Gwendolen cherished the idea that now he was struck with her talent as well as her beauty, and her uneasiness about his opinion was half turned to complacency. But too many were in the secret of what had been included in the rehearsals and what had not, and no one besides Klesmer took the trouble to soothe Gwendolen's imagined mortification. The general sentiment was that the incident should be let drop. There had really been a medium concerned in the starting open of the panel, one who had quitted the room in haste and crept to bed in much alarm of conscience. It was the small Isabel, whose intense curiosity, unsatisfied by the brief glimpse she had had of the strange picture on the day of arrival at Offendene, had kept her on the watch for an opportunity of finding out where Gwendolen had put the key, of stealing it from the discovered drawer when the rest of the family were out, and getting on a stool to unlock the panel. While she was indulging her thirst for knowledge in this way, a noise which she feared was an approaching footstep alarmed her. She closed the door and attempted hurriedly to lock it, but failing and not daring to linger, she withdrew the key and trusted that the panel would stick, as it seemed well inclined to do. In this confidence she had returned the key to its former place, stilling any anxiety by the thought that if the door were discovered to be unlocked, nobody would know how the unlocking came about. The inconvenient Isabel, like other offenders, did not foresee her own impulse to confession, a fatality which came upon her the morning after the party, when Gwendolen said at the breakfast table, "I know the door was locked before the housekeeper gave me the key, for I tried it myself afterward. Some one must have been to my drawer and taken the key." It seemed to Isabel that Gwendolen's awful eyes had rested on her more than on the other sisters, and without any time for resolve she said with a trembling lip, "Please forgive me, Gwendolen." The forgiveness was sooner bestowed than it would have been if Gwendolen had not desired to dismiss from her own and every one else's memory any case in which she had shown her susceptibility to terror. She wondered at herself in these occasional experiences, which seemed like a brief remembered madness, an unexplained exception from her normal life, and in this instance she felt a peculiar vexation that her helpless fear had shown itself not as usual in solitude, but in well-lit company.
Her ideal was to be daring in speech and reckless in braving dangers, both moral and physical, and though her practice fell far behind her ideal, this shortcoming seemed to be due to the pettiness of circumstances, the narrow theatre which life offers to a girl of 20, who cannot conceive herself as anything else than a lady, or as in any position which would lack the tribute of respect. She had no permanent consciousness of other fetters or of more spiritual restraints, having always disliked whatever was presented to her under the name of religion, in the same way that some people dislike arithmetic and accounts. It had raised no other emotion in her, no alarm, no longing, so that the question whether she believed it had not occurred to her any more than it had occurred to her to inquire into the conditions of colonial property and banking, on which, as she had had many opportunities of knowing, the family fortune was dependent. All these facts about herself she would have been ready to admit, and even more or less indirectly to state. What she unwillingly recognized, and would have been glad for others to be unaware of, was that liability of hers to fits of spiritual dread, though this fountain of awe within her had not found its way into connection with the religion taught her, or with any human relation. She was ashamed and frightened, as at what might happen again, in remembering her tremor on suddenly feeling herself alone, when, for example, she was walking without companionship, and there came some rapid change in the light. Solitude in any wide scene impressed her with an undefined feeling of immeasurable existence aloof from her, in the midst of which she was helplessly incapable of asserting herself. The little astronomy taught her at school used sometimes to set her imagination at work in a way that made her tremble, but always when some one joined her she recovered her indifference to the vastness in which she seemed an exile. She found again her usual world in which her will was of some avail, and the religious nomenclature belonging to this world was no more identified for her with those uneasy impressions of awe than her uncle's surplices seen out of use at the rectory. With human eyes and ears about her, she had always hitherto recovered her confidence and felt the possibility of winning empire. To her mamma and others, her fits of timidity or terror were sufficiently accounted for by her sensitiveness or the excitability of her nature. But these explanatory phrases required conciliation with much that seemed to be blank indifference or rare self-mastery. Heat is a great agent and a useful word, but considered as a means of explaining the universe, it requires an extensive knowledge of differences. And as a means of explaining character, sensitiveness is in much the same predicament. But who, loving a creature like Gwendolen, would not be inclined to regard every peculiarity in her as a mark of preeminence? That was what Rex did. After the Hermione scene, he was more persuaded than ever that she must be instinct with all feeling, and not only readier to respond to a worshipful love, but able to love better than other girls. Rex felt the summer on his young wings and soared happily. End of chapter 6.
This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 7. Perigot. As the bonny lass passed by, Willie, hey ho, bonny lass. Perigot. She rood at me with glancing eye. Willie. As clear as the crystal glass. Perigot. As all the sunny beam so bright. Willie. Hey ho, the sunny beam. Perigot. Glaunceth from Phoebus' face forthright. Willie. So love into thy heart did stream. Spenser, Shepherd's Calendar. The kindliest symptom, yet the most alarming crisis in the ticklish state of youth, the nourisher and destroyer of hopeful wits, the servitude above freedom, the gentle mind's religion, the liberal superstition. Charles Lamb. The first sign of the unimagined snowstorm was like the transparent white cloud that seems to set off the blue. Anna was in the secret of Rex's feeling, though for the first time in their lives he had said nothing to her about what he most thought of, and he only took it for granted that she knew it. For the first time, too, Anna could not say to Rex what was continually in her mind. Perhaps it might have been a pain which she would have had to conceal, that he should so soon care for some one else more than for herself, if such a feeling had not been thoroughly neutralized by doubt and anxiety on his behalf. Anna admired her cousin, would have said with simple sincerity, "Gwendolen is always very good to me," and held it in the order of things for herself to be entirely subject to this cousin. But she looked at her with mingled fear and distrust, with a puzzled contemplation as of some wondrous and beautiful animal whose nature was a mystery, and who, for anything Anna knew, might have an appetite for devouring all the small creatures that were her own particular pets. And now Anna's heart was sinking under the heavy conviction which she dared not utter, that Gwendolen would never care for Rex. What she herself held in tenderness and reverence had constantly seemed indifferent to Gwendolen, and it was easier to imagine her scorning Rex than returning any tenderness of his. Besides, she was always thinking of being something extraordinary, and poor Rex, papa would be angry with him if he knew, and of course he was too young to be in love in that way, and she, Anna, had thought that it would be years and years before anything of that sort came, and that she would be Rex's housekeeper ever so long. But what a heart must that be which did not return his love! Anna, in the prospect of his suffering, was beginning to dislike her too fascinating cousin. It seemed to her, as it did to Rex, that the weeks had been filled with a tumultuous life evident to all observers. If he had been questioned on the subject, he would have said that he had no wish to conceal what he hoped would be an engagement which he should immediately tell his father of. And yet for the first time in his life he was reserved not only about his feelings, but, which was more remarkable to Anna, about certain actions. She on her side was nervous each time her father or mother began to speak to her in private lest they should say anything about Rex and Gwendolen. But the elders were not in the least alive to this agitating drama, which went forward chiefly in a sort of pantomime extremely lucid in the minds thus expressing themselves, but easily missed by the spectators who were running their eyes over the Guardian or the Clerical Gazette, and regarded the trivialities of the young ones with scarcely more interpretation than they gave to the action of lively ants. "Where are you going, Rex?" said Anna one gray morning when her father had set off in his carriage to the sessions, Mrs. Gascoigne with him, and she had observed that her brother had on his antigropelos, the utmost approach he possessed to a hunting equipment. "Going to see the hounds throw off at the Three Barns." "Are you going to take Gwendolen?" said Anna timidly. "She told you, did she?" "No, but I thought—" "Does papa know you are going?" "Not that I am aware of. I don't suppose he would trouble himself about the matter." "You are going to use his horse?" "He knows I do that whenever I can." "Don't let Gwendolen ride after the hounds, Rex," said Anna, whose fears gifted her with second sight. "Why not?" said Rex, smiling rather provokingly. "Papa and mamma and Aunt Davilow all wish her not to. They think it is not right for her." "Why should you suppose she is going to do what is not right?" "Gwendolen minds nobody sometimes," said Anna, getting bolder by dint of a little anger. "Then she would not mind me," said Rex, perversely making a joke of poor Anna's anxiety. "Oh, Rex, I cannot bear it! You will make yourself very unhappy." Here Anna burst into tears. "Nanny, Nanny, what on earth is the matter with you?" said Rex, a little impatient at being kept in this way, hat on and whip in hand. "She will not care for you one bit. I know she never will," said the poor child in a sobbing whisper. She had lost all control of herself. Rex reddened and hurried away from her out of the hall door, leaving her to the miserable consciousness of having made herself disagreeable in vain. He did think of her words as he rode along. They had the unwelcomeness which all unfavorable fortune-telling has, even when laughed at, but he quickly explained them as springing from little Anna's tenderness, and began to be sorry that he was obliged to come away without soothing her. Every other feeling on the subject, however, was quickly merged in a resistant belief to the contrary of hers, accompanied with a new determination to prove that he was right. This sort of certainty had just enough kinship to doubt and uneasiness to hurry on a confession which an untouched security might have delayed. Gwendolen was already mounted and riding up and down the avenue when Rex appeared at the gate. She had provided herself against disappointment in case he should not appear in time by having the groom ready behind her, for she would not have waited beyond a reasonable time. But now the groom was dismissed, and the two rode away in delightful freedom. Gwendolen was in her highest spirits, and Rex thought that she had never looked so lovely before. Her figure, her long white throat, and the curves of her cheek and chin were always set off to perfection by the compact simplicity of her riding dress. He could not conceive a more perfect girl, and to a youthful lover like Rex it seems that the fundamental identity of the good, the true and the beautiful is always extant and manifest in the object of his love. Most observers would have held it more than equally accountable that a girl should have like impressions about Rex, for in his handsome face there was nothing corresponding to the undefinable stinging quality, as it were a trace of demon ancestry, which made some beholders hesitate in their admiration of Gwendolen. It was an exquisite January morning, in which there was no threat of rain, but a gray sky making the calmest background for the charms of a mild winter scene, the grassy borders of the lanes, the hedgerows sprinkled with red berries and haunted with low twitterings, the purple bareness of the elms, the rich brown of the furrows. The horses' hoofs made a musical chime accompanying their young voices. She was laughing at his equipment, for he was the reverse of a dandy, and he was enjoying her laughter. The freshness of the morning mingled with the freshness of their youth, and every sound that came from their clear throats, every glance they gave each other, was the bubbling outflow from a spring of joy. It was all morning to them, within and without, and thinking of them in these moments one is tempted to that futile sort of wishing, if only things could have been a little otherwise then, so as to have been greatly otherwise after. If only these two beautiful young creatures could have pledged themselves to each other then and there, and never through life have swerved from that pledge. For some of the goodness which Rex believed in was there. Goodness is a large, often a prospective word, like harvest, which at one stage when we talk of it lies all underground, with an indeterminate future. Is the germ prospering in the darkness? At another it has put forth delicate green blades, and by the trembling blossoms are ready to be dashed off by an hour of rough wind or rain. Each stage has its peculiar blight, and may have the healthy life choked out of it by a particular action of the foul land which rears or neighbors it, or by damage brought from foulness afar. "Anna has got it into her head that you would want to ride after the hounds this morning," said Rex, whose secret associations with Anna's words made this speech seem quite perilously near the most momentous of subjects. "Did she?" said Gwendolen, laughingly. "What a little clairvoyant she is!" "Shall you?" said Rex, who had not believed in her intending to do it if the elders objected, but confided in her having good reasons. "I don't know. I can't tell what I shall do till I get there. Clairvoyants are often wrong. They foresee what is likely. I am not fond of what is likely. It is always dull. I do what is unlikely." "Ah, there you tell me a secret. When once I knew what people in general would be likely to do, I should know you would do the opposite. So you would have come round to a likelihood of your own sort. I shall be able to calculate on you. You couldn't surprise me." "Yes, I could. I should turn round and do what was likely for people in general," said Gwendolen, with a musical laugh. "You see you can't escape some sort of likelihood, and contradictoriness makes the strongest likelihood of all. You must give up a plan." "No, I shall not. My plan is to do what pleases me." Here, should any young lady incline to imitate Gwendolen, Let her consider the set of her head and neck. If the angle there had been different, the chin protrusive and the cervical vertebrae a trifle more curved in their position, 10 to 1 Gwendolen's words would have had a jar in them for the sweet-natured Rex. But everything odd in her speech was humor and pretty banter, which he was only anxious to turn toward one point. "Can you manage to feel only what pleases you?" said he. "Of course not. That comes from what other people do. But if the world were pleasanter, one would only feel what was pleasant. Girls' lives are so stupid. They never do what they like." "I thought that was more the case of the men. They are forced to do hard things, and are often dreadfully bored and knocked to pieces too. And then, if we love a girl very dearly, we want to do as she likes. So after all, you have your own way." "I don't believe it. I never saw a married woman who had her own way." "What should you like to do?" said Rex, quite guilelessly and in real anxiety. "Oh, I don't know. Go to the North Pole, or ride steeplechases, or go to be a queen in the East like Lady Hester Stanhope," said Gwendolen, flightily. Her words were born on her lips, but she would have been at a loss to give an answer of deeper origin. "You don't mean you would never be married?" "No, I didn't say that. Only when I married I should not do as other women do." "You might do just as you liked if you married a man who loved you more dearly than anything else in the world," said Rex, who, poor youth, was moving in themes outside the curriculum in which he had promised to win distinction. "I know one who does." "Don't talk of Mr. Middleton, for heaven's sake," said Gwendolen, hastily, a quick blush spreading over her face and neck. "That is Anna's chant. I hear the hounds. Let us go on." She put her chestnut to a canter, and Rex had no choice but to follow her. Still he felt encouraged. Gwendolen was perfectly aware that her cousin was in love with her, but she had no idea that the matter was of any consequence, having never had the slightest visitation of painful love herself. She wished the small romance of Rex's devotion to fill up the time of his stay at Pennicote, and to avoid explanations which would bring it to an untimely end. Besides, she objected with a sort of physical repulsion to being directly made love to. With all her imaginative delight in being adored, there was a certain fierceness of maidenhood in her. But all other thoughts were soon lost for her in the excitement of the scene at the Three Barns. Several gentlemen of the hunt knew her, and she exchanged pleasant greetings. Rex could not get another word with her. The color, the stir of the field had taken possession of Gwendolen with a strength which was not due to habitual associations, for she had never yet ridden after the hounds, only said she should like to do it, and so drawn forth a prohibition. Her mamma dreading the danger, and her uncle declaring that for his part he held that kind of violent exercise unseemly in a woman, and that whatever might be done in other parts of the country, no lady of good position followed the Wessex hunt. No one but Mrs. Gadsby, the yeomanry captain's wife, who had been a kitchen maid and still spoke like one. This last argument had some effect on Gwendolen, and had kept her halting between her desire to assert her freedom and her horror of being classed with Mrs. Gadsby. Some of the most unexceptionable women in the neighborhood occasionally went to see the hounds throw off, but it happened that none of them were present this morning to abstain from following, while Mrs. Gadsby, with her doubtful antecedents, grammatical and otherwise, was not visible to make following seem unbecoming. Thus Gwendolen felt no check on the animal stimulus that came from the stir and tongue of the hounds, the pawing of the horses, the varying voices of men, the movement hither and thither of vivid color on the background of green and gray stillness, that utmost excitement of the coming chase which consists in feeling something like a combination of dog and horse, with a superadded thrill of social vanities and consciousness of centaur power which belongs to humankind. Rex would have felt more of the same enjoyment if he could have kept nearer to Gwendolen, and not seen her constantly occupied with acquaintances, or looked at by would-be acquaintances, all on lively horses which veered about and swept the surrounding space as effectually as a revolving lever. "Glad to see you here this fine morning, Miss Harleth," said Lord Brackenshaw, a middle-aged peer of aristocratic seediness in stained pink, with easy-going manners which would have made the threatened deluge seem of no consequence. "We shall have a first-rate run. A pity you didn't go with us. Have you ever tried your little chestnut at a ditch? You wouldn't be afraid, eh?" "Not the least in the world," said Gwendolen. And that was true. She was never fearful in action and companionship. I have often taken him at some rails, and a ditch too, near— "Ah, by Jove!" said his lordship quietly, in notation that something was happening which must break off the dialogue, and as he reined off his horse, Rex was bringing his sober hackney up to Gwendolen's side, when the hounds gave tongue, and the whole field was in motion as if the whirl of the earth were carrying it. Gwendolen along with everything else. No word of notice to Rex, who without a second thought followed too. Could he let Gwendolen go alone? Under other circumstances he would have enjoyed the run, but he was just now perturbed by the check which had been put on the impetus to utter his love and get utterance in return, an impetus which could not at once resolve itself into a totally different sort of chase, at least with the consciousness of being on his father's gray nag, a good horse enough in his way, but of sober years and ecclesiastical habits. Gwendolen on her spirited little chestnut was up with the best, and felt as secure as an immortal goddess, having, if she had thought of risk, a core of confidence that no ill luck would happen to her. But she thought of no such thing, and certainly not of any risk there might be for her cousin. If she had thought of him, it would have struck her as a droll picture that he should be gradually falling behind and looking round in search of gates. A fine lithe youth, whose heart must be panting with all the spirit of a beagle, stuck as if under a wizard's spell on a stiff clerical hackney, would have made her laugh with a sense of fun much too strong for her to reflect on his mortification. But Gwendolen was apt to think rather of those who saw her than of those whom she could not see, and Rex was soon so far behind that if she had looked she would not have seen him. For I grieve to say that in the search for a gate, along a lane lately mended, Primrose fell, broke his knees, and undesignedly threw Rex over his head. Fortunately a blacksmith's son, who also followed the hounds under disadvantages, namely, on foot, a loose way of hunting which had struck some even frivolous minds as immoral, was naturally also in the rear, and happened to be within sight of Rex's misfortune. He ran to give help, which was greatly needed, for Rex was a great deal stunned, and the complete recovery of sensation came in the form of pain. Joel Dagge on this occasion showed himself that most useful of personages, whose knowledge is of a kind suited to the immediate occasion. He not only knew perfectly well what was the matter with the horse, how far they were both from the nearest public house and from Pennicote Rectory, and could certify to Rex that his shoulder was only a bit out of joint, but also offered experienced surgical aid. "Lord, sir, let me shove it in again for you. I seen Nash, the bone-setter, do it, and done it myself for our little Sally twice over. It's all one and the same, shoulders is. If you'll trust un to me and tighten your mind up a bit, I'll do it for you in no time." "Come then, old fellow," said Rex, who could tighten his mind better than his seat in the saddle. And Joel managed the operation, though not without considerable expense of pain to his patient, who turned so pitiably pale while tightening his mind that Joel remarked, "Ah, sir, you aren't used to it, that's how it is. I see lots and lots of joints out. I see a man with his eye pushed out once. That was a rum go as ever I see. You can't have a bit of fun without such sort of things. But it went in again. I swallowed 3 teeth mysen, as sure as I'm alive. Now, Surrey," this was addressed to Primrose, "come along. You mustn't make believe as you can't." Joel being clearly a low character, it is happily not necessary to say more of him to the refined reader than that he helped Rex to get home with as little delay as possible. There was no alternative but to get home, though all the while he was in anxiety about Gwendolen, and more miserable in the thought that she too might have had an accident, than in the pain of his own bruises and the annoyance he was about to cause his father. He comforted himself about her by reflecting that every one would be anxious to take care of her, and that some acquaintance would be sure to conduct her home. Mr. Gascoigne was already at home, and was writing letters in his study, when he was interrupted by seeing poor Rex come in with a face which was not the less handsome and ingratiating for being pale and a little distressed. He was secretly the favorite son, and a young portrait of the father, who, however, never treated him with any partiality, rather with an extra rigor. Mr. Gascoigne, having inquired of Anna, knew that Rex had gone with Gwendolen to the meet at the Three Barns. "What is the matter?" he said hastily, not laying down his pen. "I'm very sorry, sir. Primrose has fallen down and broken his knees." "Where have you been with him?" said Mr. Gascoigne, with a touch of severity. He rarely gave way to temper. "To the Three Barns to see the hounds throw off." "And you were fool enough to follow?" "Yes, sir. I didn't go at any fences, but the horse got his leg into a hole." "And you got hurt yourself, I hope, eh?" "I got my shoulder put out, but a young blacksmith put it in again for me. I'm just a little battered, that's all." "Well, sit down." "I'm very sorry about the horse, sir. I knew it would be a vexation to you." "And what has become of Gwendolen?" said Mr. Gascoigne abruptly. Rex, who did not imagine that his father had made any inquiries about him, answered at first with a blush, which was the more remarkable for his previous paleness. Then he said nervously, "I am anxious to know. I should like to go or send at once to Offendene, but she rides so well, and I think she would keep up. There would most likely be many round her." "I suppose it was she who led you on, eh?" said Mr. Gascoigne, laying down his pen, leaning back in his chair, and looking at Rex with more marked examination. "It was natural for her to want to go. She didn't intend it beforehand. She was led away by the spirit of the thing, and of course I went when she went." Mr. Gascoigne left a brief interval of silence, and then said, with quiet irony, "But now you observe, young gentleman, that you are not furnished with a horse which will enable you to play the squire to your cousin. You must give up that amusement. You have spoiled my nag for me, and that is enough mischief for one vacation. I shall beg you to get ready to start for Southampton to‐morrow and join Stilfox till you go up to Oxford with him. That will be good for your bruises as well as your studies." Poor Rex felt his heart swelling and comporting itself as if it had been no better than a girl's. "I hope you will not insist on my going immediately, sir." "Do you feel too ill?" "No, not that. But—" Here Rex bit his lips and felt the tears starting, to his great vexation. Then he rallied and tried to say more firmly, "I want to go to Offendene, but I can go this evening." "I am going there myself. I can bring word about Gwendolen, if that is what you want." Rex broke down. He thought he discerned an intention fatal to his happiness, nay, his life. He was accustomed to believe in his father's penetration and to expect firmness. "Father, I can't go away without telling her that I love her and knowing that she loves me." Mr. Gascoigne was inwardly going through some self‐rebuke for not being more wary, and was now really sorry for the lad, but every consideration was subordinate to that of using the wisest tactics in the case. He had quickly made up his mind, and to answer the more quietly, "My dear boy, you are too young to be taking momentous, decisive steps of that sort. This is a fancy which you have got into your head during an idle week or two. You must set to work at something and dismiss it. There is every reason against it. An engagement at your age would be totally rash and unjustifiable. And moreover, alliances between first cousins are undesirable. Make up your mind to a brief disappointment. Life is full of them. We have all got to be broken in, and this is a mild beginning for you." "No, not mild. I can't bear it. I shall be good for nothing. I shouldn't mind anything if it were settled between us. I could do anything then," said Rex impetuously. "But it's of no use to pretend that I will obey you. I can't do it. If I said I would, I should be sure to break my word. I should see Gwendolen again." "Well, wait till to‐morrow morning, that we may talk of the matter again. You will promise me that?" said Mr. Gascoigne quietly. And Rex did not, could not refuse. The rector did not even tell his wife that he had any other reason for going to Offendene that evening than his desire to ascertain that Gwendolen had got home safely. He found her more than safe, elated. Mr. Quallon, who had won the brush, had delivered the trophy to her, and she had brought it before her fastened on the saddle. More than that, Lord Brackenshaw had conducted her home and had shown himself delighted with her spirited riding. All this was told at once to her uncle, that he might see how well justified she had been in acting against his advice; and the prudential rector did feel himself in a slight difficulty, for at that moment he was particularly sensible that it was his niece's serious interest to be well regarded by the Brackenshaws, and their opinion as to her following the hounds really touched the essence of his objection. However, he was not obliged to say anything immediately, for Mrs. Davilow followed up Gwendolen's brief triumphant phrases with, "Still, I do hope you will not do it again, Gwendolen. I should never have a moment's quiet. Her father died by an accident, you know." Here Mrs. Davilow had turned away from Gwendolen and looked at Mr. Gascoigne. "Mamma, dear," said Gwendolen, kissing her merrily, and passing over the question of the fears which Mrs. Davilow had meant to account for, "children don't take after their parents in broken legs." Not one word had yet been said about Rex. In fact, there had been no anxiety about him at Offendene. Gwendolen had observed to her mamma, "Oh, he must have been left far behind and gone home in despair," and it could not be denied that this was fortunate so far as it made way for Lord Brackenshaw's bringing her home. But now Mr. Gascoigne said, with some emphasis, looking at Gwendolen, "Well, the exploit has ended better for you than for Rex." "Yes, I dare say he had to make a terrible round. You have not taught Primrose to take the fences, uncle," said Gwendolen, without the faintest shade of alarm in her looks and tone. "Rex has had a fall," said Mr. Gascoigne, curtly, throwing himself into an arm-chair, resting his elbows and fitting his palms and fingers together, while he closed his lips and looked at Gwendolen, who said, "Oh, poor fellow, he is not hurt, I hope?" with a correct look of anxiety, such as elated mortals try to superinduce when their pulses are all the while quick with triumph. And Mrs. Davilow in the same moment uttered a low, "Good heavens, there!" Mr. Gascoigne went on. "He put his shoulder out and got some bruises, I believe." Here he made another little pause of observation. But Gwendolen, instead of any such symptoms as pallor and silence, had only deepened the compassionateness of her brow and eyes, and said again, "Oh, poor fellow! It is nothing serious, then?" And Mr. Gascoigne held his diagnosis complete. But he wished to make assurance doubly sure, and went on still with a purpose. "He got his arm set again rather oddly. Some blacksmith, not a parishioner of mine, was on the field—a loose fish, I suppose, but handy—and set the arm for him immediately. So after all, I believe I and Primrose come off worst. The horse's knees are cut to pieces. He came down in a hole, it seems, and pitched Rex over his head." Gwendolen's face had allowably become contented again since Rex's arm had been reset, and now at the descriptive suggestions in the latter part of her uncle's speech, her elated spirits made her features less unmanageable than usual. The smiles broke forth, and finally a descending scale of laughter. "You are a pretty young lady to laugh at other people's calamities," said Mr. Gascoigne, with a milder sense of disapprobation than if he had not had counteracting reasons to be glad that Gwendolen showed no deep feeling on the occasion. "Pray forgive me, uncle. Now Rex is safe, it is so droll to fancy the figure he and Primrose would cut, in a lane all by themselves, only a blacksmith running up. It would make a capital caricature of 'Following the Hounds.'" Gwendolen rather valued herself on her superior freedom in laughing where others might only see matter for seriousness. Indeed, the laughter became her person so well that her opinion of its gracefulness was often shared by others, and it even entered into her uncle's course of thought at this moment that it was no wonder a boy should be fascinated by this young witch, who, however, was more mischievous than could be desired. "How can you laugh at broken bones, child?" said Mrs. Davilow, still under her dominant anxiety. "I wish we had never allowed you to have the horse. You'll see that we were wrong. she added, looking with a grave nod at Mr. Gascoigne. "At least I was, to encourage her in asking for it." "Yes, seriously, Gwendolen," said Mr. Gascoigne, in a judicious tone of rational advice to a person understood to be altogether rational. "I strongly recommend you. I shall ask you to oblige me so far, not to repeat your adventure of to-day. Lord Brackenshaw is very kind, but I feel sure that he would concur with me in what I say. To be spoken of as 'the young lady who hunts' by way of exception would give a tone to the language about you which I am sure you would not like. Depend upon it, his lordship would not choose that Lady Beatrice or Lady Maria should hunt in this part of the country, if they were old enough to do so. When you are married it will be different. You may do whatever your husband sanctions. But if you intend to hunt, you must marry a man who can keep horses." "I don't know why I should do anything so horrible as to marry without that prospect, at least," said Gwendolen, pettishly. Her uncle's speech had given her annoyance, which she could not show more directly, but she felt that she was committing herself, and after moving carelessly to another part of the room, went out. "She always speaks in that way about marriage," said Mrs. Davilow. "But it will be different when she has seen the right person." "Her heart has never been in the least touched, that you know of?" said Mr. Gascoigne. Mrs. Davilow shook her head silently. "It was only last night she said to me, 'Mamma, I wonder how girls manage to fall in love. It is easy to make them do it in books, but men are too ridiculous.'" Mr. Gascoigne laughed a little, and made no further remark on the subject. The next morning at breakfast he said, "How are your bruises, Rex?" "Oh, not very mellow yet, sir. Only beginning to turn a little." "You don't feel quite ready for a journey to Southampton?" "Not quite," answered Rex, with his heart metaphorically in his mouth. "Well, you can wait till to-morrow, and go to say good-bye to them at Offendene." Mrs. Gascoigne, who now knew the whole affair, looked steadily at her coffee lest she should also begin to cry, as Anna was doing already. Mr. Gascoigne felt that he was applying a sharp remedy to poor Rex's acute attack, but he believed it to be in the end the kindest. To let him know the hopelessness of his love from Gwendolen's own lips might be curative in more ways than one. "I can only be thankful that she doesn't care about him," said Mrs. Gascoigne, when she joined her husband in his study. "There are things in Gwendolen I cannot reconcile myself to. My Anna is worth two of her, with all her beauty and talent. It looks very ill in her that she will not help in the schools with Anna, not even in the Sunday school. What you or I advise is of no consequence to her, and poor Fanny is completely under her thumb. But I know you think better of her." Mrs. Gascoigne ended with a deferential hesitation. "Oh, my dear, there is no harm in the girl. It is only that she has a high spirit, and it will not do to hold the reins too tight. The point is, to get her well married. She has a little too much fire in her for her present life with her mother and sisters. It is natural and right that she should be married soon—not to a poor man, but one that can give her a fitting position." Presently Rex, with his arm in a sling, was on his 2 miles' walk to Offendene. He was rather puzzled by the unconditional permission to see Gwendolen, but his father's real ground of action could not enter into his conjectures. If it had, he would first have thought it horribly cold-blooded, and then have disbelieved in his father's conclusions. When he got to the house, everybody was there but Gwendolen. The 4 girls, hearing him speak in the hall, rushed out of the library, which was their schoolroom, and hung round him with compassionate inquiries about his arm. Mrs. Davilow wanted to know exactly what had happened, and where the blacksmith lived, that she might make him a present; while Miss Merry, who took a subdued and melancholy part in all family affairs, doubted whether it would not be giving too much encouragement to that kind of character. Rex had never found the family troublesome before, but just now he wished them all away and Gwendolen there, and he was too uneasy for good-natured feigning. When at last he had said, "Where's Gwendolen?" and Mrs. Davilow had told Alice to go and see if her sister were come down, adding, "I sent up her breakfast this morning. She needed a long rest," Rex took the shortest way out of his endurance by saying, almost impatiently, "Aunt, I want to speak to Gwendolen. I want to see her alone." "Very well, dear. Go into the drawing‐room. I will send her there," said Mrs. Davilow, who had observed that he was fond of being with Gwendolen, as was natural, but had not thought of this as having any bearing on the realities of life. It seemed merely part of the Christmas holidays which were spinning themselves out. Rex for his part thought that the realities of life were all hanging on this interview. He had to walk up and down the drawing room in expectation for nearly 10 minutes, ample space for all imaginative fluctuations. Yet, strange to say, he was unvaryingly occupied in thinking what and how much he could do, when Gwendolen had accepted him, to satisfy his father that the engagement was the most prudent thing in the world, since it inspired him with double energy for work. He was to be a lawyer, and what reason was there why he should not rise as high as Eldon did? He was forced to look at life in the light of his father's mind. But when the door opened, and she whose presence he was longing for entered, there came over him suddenly and mysteriously a state of tremor and distrust which he had never felt before. Miss Gwendolen, simple as she stood there in her black silk, cut square round the white pillar of her throat, a black band fastening her hair, which streamed backward in smooth silky abundance, seemed more queenly than usual. Perhaps it was that there was none of the latent fun and tricksiness which had always pierced in her greeting of Rex. How much of this was due to her presentiment from what he had said yesterday that he was going to talk of love? How much from her desire to show regret about his accident? Something of both. But the wisdom of ages has hinted that there is a side of the bed which has a malign influence if you happen to get out on it. And this accident befalls some charming persons rather frequently. Perhaps it had befallen Gwendolen this morning. The hastening of her toilette, the way in which Bugle used the brush, the quality of the shilling serial mistakenly written for her amusement, the probabilities of the coming day, and in short, social institutions generally, were all objectionable to her. It was not that she was out of temper, but that the world was not equal to the demands of her fine organism. However it might be, Rex saw an awful majesty about her as she entered and put out her hand to him without the least approach to a smile in eyes or mouth. The fun which had moved her in the evening had quite evaporated from the image of his accident, and the whole affair seemed stupid to her. But she said with perfect propriety, "I hope you are not much hurt, Rex. I deserve that you should reproach me for your accident." "Not at all," said Rex, feeling the soul within him spreading itself like an attack of illness. "There is hardly anything the matter with me. I am so glad you had the pleasure. I would willingly pay for it by a tumble, only I was sorry to break the horse's knees." Gwendolen walked to the hearth and stood looking at the fire in the most inconvenient way for conversation, so that he could only get a side view of her face. "My father wants me to go to Southampton for the rest of the vacation," said Rex, his baritone trembling a little. "Southampton? That's a stupid place to go, isn't it?" said Gwendolen, chilly. "It would be to me, because you would not be there." Silence. "Should you mind about me going away, Gwendolen?" "Of course. Every one is of consequence in this dreary country," said Gwendolen curtly. The perception that poor Rex wanted to be tender made her curl up and harden like a sea anemone at the touch of a finger. "Are you angry with me, Gwendolen? Why do you treat me in this way all at once?" said Rex, flushing and with more spirit in his voice, as if he too were capable of being angry. Gwendolen looked round at him and smiled. "Treat you? Nonsense! I am only rather cross. Why did you come so very early? You must expect to find tempers in deshabille." "Be as cross with me as you like, only don't treat me with indifference," said Rex imploringly. "All the happiness of my life depends on your loving me, if only a little, better than any one else." He tried to take her hand, but she hastily eluded his grasp and moved to the other end of the hearth, facing him. "Pray don't make love to me. I hate it." She looked at him fiercely. Rex turned pale and was silent, but could not take his eyes off her, and the impetus was not yet exhausted that made hers dart death at him. Gwendolen herself could not have foreseen that she should feel in this way. It was all a sudden, new experience to her. The day before she had been quite aware that her cousin was in love with her. She did not mind how much, so that he said nothing about it. And if any one had asked her why she objected to love-making speeches, she would have said laughingly, "Oh, I'm tired of them all in the books." But now the life of passion had begun negatively in her. She felt passionately averse to this volunteered love. To Rex at 20 the joy of life seemed at an end more absolutely than it can do to a man at 40. But before they had ceased to look at each other, he did speak again. "Is that the last word you have to say to me, Gwendolen? Will it always be so?" She could not help seeing his wretchedness and feeling a little regret for the old Rex who had not offended her. Decisively, but yet with some return of kindness, she said, "About making love, yes, but I don't dislike you for anything else." There was just a perceptible pause before he said a low "good-bye," and passed out of the room. Almost immediately after she heard the heavy hall door bang behind him. Mrs. Davilow too had heard Rex's hasty departure, and presently came into the drawing-room, where she found Gwendolen seated on the low couch, her face buried, and her hair falling over her figure like a garment. She was sobbing bitterly. My child, what is it?" cried the mother, who had never before seen her darling struck down in this way, and felt something of the alarmed anguish that women feel at the sight of overpowering sorrow in a strong man, for this child had been her ruler. Sitting down by her with circling arms, she pressed her cheek against Gwendolen's head, and then tried to draw it upward. Gwendolen gave way, and letting her head rest against her mother, cried out sobbingly, "Oh, mamma, what can become of my life? There's nothing worth living for." "Why, dear?" said Mrs. Davilow. Usually she herself had been rebuked by her daughter for involuntary signs of despair. "I shall never love anybody. I can't love people. I hate them." "The time will come, dear, the time will come." Gwendolen was more and more convulsed with sobbing, but putting her arms round her mother's neck with an almost painful clinging, she said brokenly, "I can't bear any one to be very near me but you." Then the mother began to sob, for this spoiled child had never shown such dependence on her before, and so they clung to each other. End of chapter 7. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda, by George Eliot. Chapter 8. What name doth joy most borrow when life is fair? Tomorrow. What name doth best fit sorrow in young despair? Tomorrow. There was a much more lasting trouble at the rectory. Rex arrived there only to throw himself on his bed in a state of apparent apathy, unbroken till the next day, when it began to be interrupted by more positive signs of illness. Nothing could be said about his going to Southampton. Instead of that, the chief thought of his mother and Anna was how to tend this patient who did not want to be well, and from being the brightest, most grateful spirit in the household, was metamorphosed into an irresponsive, dull-eyed creature who met all affectionate attempts with a murmur of "Let me alone." His father looked beyond the crisis and believed it to be the shortest way out of an unlucky affair, but he was sorry for the inevitable suffering, and went now and then to sit by him in silence for a few minutes, parting with a gentle pressure of his hand on Rex's blank brow and a "God bless you, my boy." Warham and the younger children used to peep round the edge of the door to see this incredible thing of their lively brother being laid low, but fingers were immediately shaken at them to drive them back. The guardian who was always there was Anna, and her little hand was allowed to rest within her brother's, though he never gave it a welcoming pressure. Her soul was divided between anguish for Rex and reproach of Gwendolen. "Perhaps it is wicked of me, but I think I never can love her again," came as the recurrent burden of poor little Anna's inward monody, and even Mrs. Gascoigne had an angry feeling toward her niece which she could not refrain from expressing, apologetically, to her husband. "I know of course it is better, and we ought to be thankful that she is not in love with the poor boy. But really, Henry, I think she is hard. She has the heart of a coquette. I cannot help thinking that she must have made him believe something, or the disappointment would not have taken hold of him in that way. And some blame attaches to poor Fanny. She is quite blind about that girl." Mr. Gascoigne answered imperatively, "The less said on that point the better, Nancy. I ought to have been more awake myself. As to the boy, be thankful if nothing worse ever happens to him. Let the thing die out as quickly as possible, and especially with regard to Gwendolen, let it be as if it had never been." The rector's dominant feeling was that there had been a great escape. Gwendolen in love with Rex in return would have made a much harder problem, the solution of which might have been taken out of his hands. But he had to go through some further difficulty. One fine morning Rex asked for his bath and made his toilette as usual. Anna, full of excitement at this change, could do nothing but listen for his coming down, and at hearing his step ran to the foot of the stairs to meet him. For the first time he gave her a faint smile, but it looked so melancholy on his pale face that she could hardly help crying. "Nanny," he said gently, taking her hand and leading her slowly along with him to the drawing-room. His mother was there, and when she came to kiss him, he said, "What a plague I am!" Then he sat still and looked out of the bow window on the lawn and shrubs covered with hoar-frost, across which the sun was sending faint occasional gleams. Something like that sad smile on Rex's face, Anna thought. He felt as if he had had a resurrection into a new world, and did not know what to do with himself there, the old interests being left behind. Anna sat near him, pretending to work, but really watching him with yearning looks. Beyond the garden hedge there was a road where wagons and carts sometimes went on field work. A railed opening was made in the hedge, because the upland with its bordering wood and clump of ash trees against the sky was a pretty sight. Presently there came along a wagon laden with timber. The horses were straining their grand muscles, and the driver, having cracked his whip, ran along anxiously to guide the leader's head, fearing a swerve. Rex seemed to be shaken into attention, rose and looked till the last quivering trunk of the timber had disappeared, and then walked once or twice along the room. Mrs. Gascoigne was no longer there, and when he came to sit down again, Anna, seeing a return of speech in her brother's eyes, could not resist the impulse to bring a little stool and seat herself against his knee, looking up at him with an expression which seemed to say, "Do speak to me." And he spoke. "I'll tell you what I'm thinking of, Nanny. I will go to Canada, or somewhere of that sort." Rex had not studied the character of our colonial possessions. "Oh, Rex, not for always." "Yes, to get my bread there. I should like to build a hut and work hard at clearing, and have everything wild about me, and a great wide quiet." "And not take me with you," said Anna, the big tears coming fast. "How could I?" "I should like it better than anything. And settlers go with their families. I would sooner go there than stay here in England. I could make the fires, and mend the clothes, and cook the food, and I could learn how to make the bread before we went. It would be nicer than anything, like playing at life over again as we used to do when we made our tent with the drugget and had our little plates and dishes." "Father and mother would not let you go." "Yes, I think they would, when I explained everything. It would save money, and papa would have more to bring up the boys with." There was further talk of the same practical kind at intervals, and it ended in Rex's being obliged to consent that Anna should go with him when he spoke to his father on the subject. Of course it was when the rector was alone in his study. Their mother would become reconciled to whatever he decided on, but mentioned to her first, the question would have distressed her. "Well, my children," said Mr. Gascoigne cheerfully as they entered. It was a comfort to see Rex about again. "May we sit down with you a little, papa?" said Anna. "Rex has something to say." "With all my heart." It was a noticeable group that these three creatures made, each of them with a face of the same structural type: the straight brow, the nose suddenly straightened from an intention of being aquiline, the short upper lip, the short but strong and well hung chin. There was even the same tone of complexion and set of the eye. The gray-haired father was at once massive and keen-looking. There was a perpendicular line in his brow which when he spoke with any force of interest deepened, and the habit of ruling gave him an air of reserved authoritativeness. Rex would have seemed a vision of his father's youth if it had been possible to imagine Mr. Gascoigne without distinct plans and without command, smitten with a heart sorrow and having no more notion of concealment than a sick animal. And Anna was a tiny copy of Rex, with hair drawn back and knotted, her face following his in its changes of expression, as if they had one soul between them. "You know all about what has upset me, father," Rex began, and Mr. Gascoigne nodded. "I am quite done up for life in this part of the world. I am sure it will be no use my going back to Oxford. I couldn't do any reading. I should fail, and cause you expense for nothing. I want to have your consent to take another course, sir." Mr. Gascoigne nodded more slowly. The perpendicular line on his brow deepened, and Anna's trembling increased. "If you would allow me a small outfit, I should like to go to the colonies and work on the land there." Rex thought the vagueness of the phrase prudential, the colonies necessarily embracing more advantages, and being less capable of being rebutted on a single ground than any particular settlement. "Oh, and with me, papa," said Anna, not bearing to be left out from the proposal even temporarily. "Rex would want some one to take care of him, you know, some one to keep house, and we shall never, either of us, be married. And I should cost nothing, and I should be so happy. I know it would be hard to leave you and mamma, but there are all the others to bring up, and we two should be no trouble to you any more." Anna had risen from her seat and used the feminine argument of going closer to her papa as she spoke. He did not smile, but he drew her on his knee and held her there, as if to put her gently out of the question while he spoke to Rex. "You will admit that my experience gives me some power of judging for you, and that I can probably guide you in matters better than you can guide yourself?" Rex was obliged to say, "Yes, sir." "And perhaps you will admit, though I don't wish to press that point, that you are bound in duty to consider my judgment and wishes?" "I have never yet placed myself in opposition to you, sir." Rex in his secret soul could not feel that he was bound not to go to the colonies, but to go to Oxford again, which was the point in question. "But you will do so if you persist in setting your mind toward a rash and foolish procedure and deafening yourself to considerations which my experience of life assures me of. You think, I suppose, that you have had a shock which has changed all your inclinations, stupefied your brains, unfitted you for anything but manual labor, and given you a dislike to society? Is that what you believe?" "Something like that. I shall never be up to the sort of work I must do to live in this part of the world. I have not the spirit for it. I shall never be the same again. And without any disrespect to you, father, I think a young fellow should be allowed to choose his way of life, if he does nobody any harm. There are plenty to stay at home, and those who like might be allowed to go where there are empty places." "But suppose I am convinced on good evidence, as I am, that this state of mind of yours is transient, and that if you went off as you propose you would by and by repent, and feel that you had let yourself slip back from the point you had been gaining by your education till now. Have you not strength of mind enough to see that you had better act on my assurance for a time, and test it? In my opinion, so far from agreeing with you that you should be free to turn yourself into a colonist and work in your shirt sleeves with spade and hatchet, in my opinion, you have no right whatever to expatriate yourself until you have honestly endeavored to turn to account the education you have received here. I say nothing of the grief to your mother and me." "I am very sorry, but what can I do? I can't study, that's certain," said Rex. "Not just now, perhaps. You will have to miss a term. I have made arrangements for you, how you are to spend the next 2 months. But I confess I am disappointed in you, Rex. I thought you had more sense than to take up such ideas. To suppose that because you have fallen into a very common trouble, such as most men have to go through, you are loosened from all bonds of duty, just as if your brain had softened and you were no longer a responsible being." What could Rex say? Inwardly he was in a state of rebellion, but he had no arguments to meet his father's. And while he was feeling, in spite of anything that might be said, that he should like to go off to the colonies to morrow, it lay in a deep fold of his consciousness that he ought to feel, if he had been a better fellow he would have felt, more about his old ties. This is the sort of faith we live by in our soul sicknesses. Rex got up from his seat as if he held the conference to be at an end. "You assent my arrangement, then?" said Mr. Gascoigne, with that distinct resolution of tone which seems to hold one in a vice. There was a little pause before Rex answered. "I'll try what I can do, sir. I can't promise." His thought was that trying would be of no use. Her father kept Anna, holding her fast, though she wanted to follow Rex. "Oh, papa," she said, the tears coming with her words when the door had closed, "it is very hard for him. Doesn't he look ill?" "Yes, but he will soon be better. It will all blow over. And now, Anna, be as quiet as a mouse about it all. Never let it be mentioned when he is gone." "No, papa, but I would not be like Gwendolen for anything, to have people fall in love with me so. It is very dreadful." Anna dared not say that she was disappointed at not being allowed to go to the colonies with Rex, but that was her secret feeling, and she often afterward went inwardly over the whole affair, saying to herself, "I should have done with going out, and gloves, and crinoline, and having to talk when I am taken to dinner, and all that." I like to mark the time and connect the course of individual lines with the historic stream, for all classes of thinkers. This was the period when the broadening of gauge in crinolines seemed to demand an agitation for the general enlargement of churches, ballrooms, and vehicles. But Anna Gascoigne's figure would only allow the size of skirt manufactured for young ladies of 14. End of chapter 8. This recording is in the public domain.